So we'll open our meeting here, and I want to make an announcement. First of all, Representative Stockstill is replacing Representative Probst today. Welcome. First thing on our agenda is bill introductions. Do we have any bill introductions? Representative Croft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask for the committee to accept introduction of RS 3063. You'll remember last year, Senate Bill 90. This is the upper story initiative that would make it applicable to structures that are located in severely distressed urban census tracts.
Okay, committee, any more bill introductions? Representative Auerkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is on behalf of Representative Susan Humphreys. It's RS 2418, and it concerns real estate brokers relating to the Real Estate Brokers and Sales Persons License Act, prohibiting the denial of access to or memberships in multiple listing service based on certain circumstances.
Okay, thank you. Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of our missing member, Representative Probst, I would ask the committee introduction of 22 RS 3027 relative to making bus drivers eligible for unemployment.
Okay, thank you. Without objection, those three bills will be entered. Eric, do you have a bill?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. Eric Stafford, Vice President of Government Affairs with the Kansas Chamber of Commerce, asking for the committee to introduce RS number 2946. It's a cleanup bill dealing with unemployment insurance following last year's House Bill 2196.
Okay, so noted. Without objections, is there any other bills to be introduced today? If not, committee it's not on our agenda, but our chairman has asked J.G. Scott to be here today to give us the latest rundown on our budget. J.G., welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. It's good to be in front of you guys, as long as you don't ask any questions. What I was asked to do is to put some profiles together that go out through 2026 that has both the governor's recommendation and different versions of the Apex bill that are out there. So what you will have in front of you shortly are three different profiles that speak to what those ending balances will do. A profile is a really pretty basic document that talks about beginning balances, the amount of revenue that we have coming in, adjustments, and then from that we subtract out the expenditures that the state is anticipating to make and end up with an ending balance for each of the different years. So if you look at the green sheet of paper that is profile lower right-hand corner 22007, you'll see a document, a profile that has what the governor's recommendation is, and included in that amount is the Apex adjustments that were included as well. So those two items were combined into one for both the revenue and for expenditures. So Senate Bill 347 didn't impact 2022. So the 22 numbers are exactly as the governor's recommendations were made. We started off 22 with $2 billion, almost $2.1 billion in a beginning balance. The consensus revenue had estimated about $8.9 billion in receipts. The governor's adjustments reduced revenue by almost $600 million. Expenditures, approved expenditures, were $8.143 billion, with reappropriations and the human services caseloads and school finance adjustments. The governor made additional adjustments totaling $1.2 billion. So total revenue available was $10.3 billion, expenditures $9.3 billion, it leaving a $1 billion ending balance for 2022. Same issues for 2023, though there is the beginning of the Apex assumptions that the governor made. So the total revenue adjustments would move to $531 million. This amount includes the governor's recommendation for sales tax on food elimination. The expenditures include the $250 adjustment for the rebate back to individuals. That shows up in the 22 number. So when we look at 23, the $8 billion for where we started as far as expenditures go for 23. Again, we made some adjustments for caseloads and school finance. The governor's recommendation with the Apex adjustments would total $772 million. Both of 22 and 23 include one-time expenditures for in the governor's recommendation. So when we look at 23, the $772 million includes about $440 million in one-time expenditures. We use that expenditure total to start the next fiscal year since we have no base to start 24 with. When we look at the ending balance in 2023, it's $616 million. Moving that up to our beginning balance, including the consensus revenue estimates. It's listed as consensus revenue estimates. This is basically the legislative research estimates for 24, 25, and 26. Those estimates include a steady state, if you will, for going forward. One of our representatives' favorite words, steady state. It has an increase of about 1.8%, so no major changes for anything coming in to the positive, no type of recession or drop-off in revenues as well. So that would leave us with the Apex adjustments of $684 million plus the GovRec at $9 billion, almost $10 billion in revenue. Our 8.9 adjusted for human services caseloads and school finance, along with the money adding back for the governor's one-time adjustments. Remember, we said that $8.9 billion in expenditures, move that forward to start with. Governor's making those one-time expenditures, have to back those back out of the total, plus an adjustment of about $68 million for the governor's Medicaid Expansion plan, leaves an ending balance of about $486 million, and we move those forward through 2025. The ending balance would be around $200 million, and for this projection, the ending balance for 2026, oops, I'm sorry, I was looking at the wrong page. The ending balance for 24 would be 477 million. 25 would be about 119 million, and 26 would be negative $426 million. There are assumptions that were made for Apex. There's not been a fiscal note put out because there are too many variables on what would impact that fiscal note, how fast they make some of the investments, what payroll will be. So what we've done for this is just put some standard assumptions that we're going to follow all the way through. Those assumptions were in the investment tax credit. The governor had it as a refundable tax credit. The investments would be made over 5 years. It would have a credit of 15% that would be spread over 3 years. So the first year there was an investment. That investment would be at 15% of the investment and spread over 3 years. So instead of being a straight 5-year, this would run through an 8-year total for that last 5th year to go through the 3 years. The supplier investment tax credit was once again refundable, 15% over 3 years. This is based on a $2 billion investment for suppliers. The firm investment was estimated for this purpose at $5 billion. Payroll reduction reimbursement. There's a 10% reimbursement for 10 years in the governor's original. That would be based on 4,000 jobs at $50,000 salary. So it would be 10% of those total salaries over 10 years. Supplier reimbursement would be different. It would be 65% of withholding for 10 years. And once again, that's estimated on 4,000 jobs at $50,000 a year. Two different groups of people, same total number of jobs. 4,000 for the firm, and then 4,000 for the suppliers. And as you know, the firm can identify 5 suppliers. So we would, in this estimate, we would anticipate those 5 suppliers to bring in a total of 4,000 jobs. There's also training reimbursement, 50% of the total expenditures for 5 years, though there is a cap of $5 million a year for the firm. Supplier training has a similar 50% of expenditures for 5 years. And once again, a $5 million cap for training for each of the 5 suppliers. So those were the assumptions that were made to work through this proposal. Once again, pretty steady state revenue going forward, about a 1.8% increase going forward, minimal expenditure adjustments at only including the expenditures increases for human services caseloads and school finance. So that's the green sheet of paper that we have that talks about those ending balances. A lot of variables in this, and like I said, the governor did have those recommendations. We don't have a solid number. This is information that's been made public. I've heard announcements that they think it's going to be a $4 billion adjustment. I've heard that a good estimate for jobs would be 4,000 for each at $50,000 a year. The others are just information that was included in the bill as it started.
Okay, so committee, those of you that are on the Appropriations Committee has already been through the first part of this, and so I apologize for any repetitiveness. I just felt it important that we look at both sides of this coin. While the benefit is great we also need to make sure that we're mindful of our pocketbook so that we can afford these types of offers in order to get to the benefits that the state will receive. I'm going to go ahead and open questions right now for JG on this first part, and we'll start with Representative Highland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for coming, JG. Did I understand you to say that the governor's, the green sheet, included Medicaid expansion included in there?
It was included in the governor's recommendation, yes.
And
both
how
the
much, and where is that in the line item? How much is it per year?
Actually, there is a reimbursement that the federal government adds for Medicaid expansion. I am sorry, I don't remember how much the original savings was.
Representative Carpenter.
Mr. Chairman, it's 85 million SGF. 85 million SGF.
And that is to the positive or to the negative?
That's the savings that are in the budget is 85 million.
Okay.
And that would be because the federal government is providing an incentive in the Medicaid match to states who have not implemented it yet.
Correct. The federal portion is 597 million.
So where does that show up? Is that in 2024 is where that starts showing up, or where in this green sheet?
It starts showing up in 2023.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, JG.
Yeah, so for clarification, this is the governor's budget as she proposed it with the Apex bill added in. So these are the numbers that were generated by her wishes. We all know that when these things hit appropriations, somehow our costs increase and not decrease. And so the numbers could be different going forward. Representative Auerkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. JG, on the governor's Apex assumption, can you break it down into the two categories? So we have revenue, Apex assumption, I'm seeing that as a negative $596 million. Is that correct?
That would be for both. For 23, about 507 million of that is in her other tax adjustments that she's made in her governor's proposal. About 450 million of that is in the food sales tax. And then there's some money in there for STAR bonds and some transfers.
So how much of that, or is any of that related to the Apex bill? Of the $596 million in fiscal year 2022?
There would not be a lot included in there, maybe $25 million.
In the second part, down in expenditures, on the governor's Apex assumption, 1.2 plus billion dollars. Can you break that number down?
For 22, the 1.2 billion would not include anything for the Apex. For 23, the expenditures for Apex is about $30 million. And it's $30 million for 5 years. So that one's pretty constant.
Representative, you got a follow-up or you want to wait?
I will in a few minutes. Thank you,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
So JG, the original bill called for a refundable tax credit of 15% of the investment over a 3-year period.
Correct.
And so how do you get a $30 million over a 5-year period? Wouldn't that be, it would all be paid over a 3-year period?
A portion of that is in the revenue. The only thing that shows up in the expenditure side is the reimbursement for the training. So it would have the $5 million that the firm gets for training adjustment and $25 million for the suppliers. That's the only thing that shows up in the expenditure side. The rest of that is all in the revenue adjustments.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Does that clear things up for you? We're basically on a $4 billion investment, we're receiving $600 million less in revenue over a 3-year period. Something like that, or
600, it would be over that 8 years, but yes.
So, Mr. Chairman, may I? So if we're receiving less revenue on a refundable tax credit, that is based on the assumption that the firm had a tax liability equal to or greater than the refundable amount, correct?
The refundable means that no matter whether, if they don't have a dollar's worth of income, they're going to get all of that tax credit.
We're writing them a check out of SGF.
We'll write them a check out of the SGF if they don't have anything to offset that.
So it's not really a reduction in revenue, that's actually an expenditure, right?
But it would show up because it's a credit. It would come from the refund fund.
But it's not actually a tax credit. If they don't have that tax liability, we're writing them a check under the governor's plan.
Correct.
Then, based on those numbers, how much of the Apex assumption in the revenue are we going to be writing them a check? What's the amount of money we're writing them a check for?
Over those 8 years, it would be $600 million. And once again, this all depends on when you start to make those investments. $4 billion over 5 years, it could be shifting between those years, but if they make that $4 billion investment over those 8 years, 5 years plus the 3 they can spread it, we would be basically refunding them $600 million. And then that same thing would go for the suppliers as well.
And we're just talking about the green paper right now, is that correct?
this is the governor's bill as introduced.
Okay.
And yeah, there's a 15% tax credit for both suppliers and and the main firm. And it is a refundable tax credit. It's just how they account for it. The state accounts for tax credits in revenue, so it would just be less revenue coming in, even though we are writing a check for $600 million out of the fund, it's the state general fund.
Sorry, these are some big numbers. I think it's worth actually going through them. So 600 million to the firm. How much are you estimating we're likely going to be writing a check to the suppliers as well?
And once again, just assumptions.
Potentially, worst case scenario.
We wrote in an assumption of an investment from the 5 suppliers at about $2 billion.
And that's, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's a total investment, not $2 billion each.
Correct.
Right, okay.
Correct. Thank you. A total investment of the 5 of $2 billion. So based on that, over the same period of time, they would get about a $300 million credit.
So am I hearing this correct, that 600 million plus 300 million, and that's all a refundable tax credit, which with depreciation and all the startup costs and everything else, more than likely they're not going to have a tax liability. So we are asking the taxpayers of Kansas to pay over, let's say, the next 8 years, $900 million to this one firm and 5 suppliers.
Based on these assumptions, yes.
Thank you.
Representative Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. JG, I just wanted to confirm that the $250 back to taxpayers in the governor's budget shows up in 23,
It shows up in 22.
22. And what is that figure, that assumption?
$460 million.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Clayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, JG. So we're talking about these assumptions, and we discussed this in approps earlier. Do they reflect the over 200 million that has come in over estimates since November? How accurate is this, especially in regards to revenue?
And I am sorry, I was going to mention that to start off with because I knew you were going to ask that question. But the answer is no, that does not include the $200 million that were up already. All of these assumptions are based on the consensus revenue estimates. So there's been no adjustments for anything coming in above that, and we're up over $200 million now. That's not included in any of these projections going forward.
And so this is basically a snapshot of us circa November of last year, correct?
For revenue projections, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Mason, and then back to our camp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. JG, how much is paid in corporate income taxes statewide on an annual basis, roughly?
It's a little over 600 million projected this year. I think next year we have it estimated to be around 535 million.
So if we were to step that down 0.5% for 2 projects, or maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, is that shown in on the yellow sheet, that 1% reduction?
No, this is the governor's recommendation that she started off with, and that was not included in the original one.
Okay.
It'll be in the Senate when we look at it.
Okay. The yellow sheet's the House assumption, right? Would that be reflected in
Yes.
that? Okay.
Representative Auerkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks again. So, so over the 8 years between the firm refund, the supplier's refund, we're looking at $900 million. And then we add in payroll reimbursement, and I've heard numbers, and I've run the same numbers, it's about $20 million a year, and the state's paying for that business's payroll, which is still odd to me.
10%.
10%. So there's another $20 million a year. And then we, according to the governors, it's a withholding. They're able to keep back a certain amount of their payroll taxes, if you will, right, for the suppliers.
About 4 million, 3.9.
Okay. And then we're also paying for firm training and supplier training. Sorry if you already said this, but can you add that per, let's say, on an annual estimate, what you're estimating the training reimbursement that the state's paying for?
Well, training, we're estimating 5% for the firm and 25 million for the suppliers for 5 years. So that would be 25 million over the 5 years and 125 million for the firm, or for the suppliers.
So that's $30 million a year. So we're up to an add-on of
Yes, $30 million a year.
another $55 million per year.
So if you were to add up over 10 years, what it would total?
No, just more over 8 years, and then over each year on the annual ones, probably about another 50-something million dollars a year per year.
Yeah, but I mean, we're not estimating that. The only thing that's going to be pretty constant is the reimbursement of payroll and withholding, and then the training. The others is really pretty variable.
Okay. Wow. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so seeing no more questions on the proposed governor's budget and Apex bill, we'll move on to the Senate version, which is the orange-ish sheet.
I think they call it salmon.
I
But I
can't
would
say
have called
that.
it orangish. Okay, all of the working document is the same. The only thing that changed are the assumptions that were made. So we'll skip over everything. The assumptions that the Senate made, the firm investments, they made it non-refundable. So the same $4 billion and the same 3 years, 5 years to invest. Because, as Representative Awerkamp had mentioned, we would not anticipate having any income coming in. So over this period of time, over these 8 years, we said that that was a zero cost to the state, both for the suppliers and the firm. So that amount was zero. I don't believe we made any changes, that the Senate made any changes to the firm and supplier payroll reimbursement. They did not make any changes to the training. The other thing that they did make a change to is they added language that every year that the firm or supplier received a benefit, corporate income taxes would drop 0.5% each year. So the first payment they would receive would drop the corporate rate 0.5%. The second year, it would be a 1%, and it would keep moving that direction until all of the benefit time periods that the firm or supplier was receiving a benefit would expire. So if we were looking at a 10-year, it would probably reduce that corporate income tax to about 2%. And if something were to continue, it would continue dropping that amount until it virtually got to zero. When we factor in those two adjustments, and a lot of the refundable credit was offset by corporate income tax reductions, but between the two, it still reduced that ending balance from a negative $426 million to $299 million. So spread out, same assumptions, just changing the apex portion. It would run negative in 26 by about $300 million.
Any questions on the Senate bill that was sent over and how it affects the budget? Okay, seeing no questions on that, we'll move on to the proposed House amendment that has not gone on yet, but the assumption is that it will, and that's what these assumptions are. Thank you.
Correct. So what we have, the yellow sheet is projections based on the House Apex information. The changes that are listed there is the firm would get a refundable tax credit. It would build up over the 5 years. They would have 5 years to invest that. But instead of spreading that over 3 years, it would spread it over 10 years. So that first year tax credit would stay there for 10 years before it would fully expire. So they would be receiving 1/10 of that each year for 10 years. The supplier tax credit was, once again, over 5 years coming in. It would be 10% spread over 10 years. The same $4 billion investment for the firm, same $2 billion investment for the supplier. Both spread over 10 years. firm at 15%, the supplier at 10%. The payroll reimbursement would be at 7.5% instead of at the 10% for 10 years on the 4,000 jobs at 50,000 for the firm. No adjustments for the supplier. So it would be available for 10 years at 65% of the withholding amount. Training was not adjusted for the firm, so it would be 50% over 5 years, maxing out at $5 million. Supplier training would be 50% of expenditures for 5 years, maxing out at $125 million for all 5 firms. So it would be $250,000 a year per supplier. And then the corporate income tax reduction would be a 0.5% reduction that would occur in year 3, and then it would be reduced another 0.5% for every other additional project that comes in. So when we roll all of those adjustments into this profile, it would show in 2026, with everything else being consistent, about a $267 million positive ending balance. And the majority of those adjustments would be in spreading out that tax credit, which is refundable, over 10 years instead of spreading it out over 3 years. So over the 15 years, the firm would still get the same $600 million, but it's spread over 15 years versus the 8 years that the original proposal included. And then the supplier would be reduced to a total of $50 million, once again spread over those total of 15 years.
Representative Dotson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. When you look at these 3 together, you see that the expenditures each year are about the same. When you look at revenue, when coming from the governor's budget to the Senate to the House, there's about a $650 million plus in the House. Is this because of the way you do accounting, that it's all in revenue rather than an expense?
Yes, exactly right. We're only showing those expenditures for that reimbursement of training. That's the only thing that's showing up in the expenditure side. So it won't change hardly anything in there when you look at the big picture. Almost all of those adjustments are in revenues because it's classified as a credit. Even if we are writing a check, it shows up as a reduction of revenue for both of the firm and the supplier.
So, and of course, it translates to the bottom line of a $650 million change in the amount that can be taken to the next year.
Over the total.
All right. Thank you.
So I would also point out that that $200 million mentioned earlier is also not reflected in this, but I can't imagine Medicaid expansion passing this year. And so when you take out the additional $85 million over all these years, it more than cancels that $200 million out. Also, these outlooks are based on revenue estimates that have a pretty rosy outlook going forward, and it doesn't account for any bumps. And so our question today is, it's very important to bring a huge opportunity like this to the table, but how do we do it and protect our budget? And just in case, what if we're not, we don't, the outlook isn't as rosy as we think it is over the next 5 or 6 years. And can we afford to be loosey-goosey on the purse straps? Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it looks like the House version actually gives us a positive ending balance. It's the only one that does. And as I'm going through these House Apex assumptions, and please tell me if I'm asking too much, would it be possible to get a table that actually shows the numbers worked out? Because the accounting here, it has all of the assumptions embedded together. And if we looked at each one, we could figure out 600 million divided by 10, 600 million divided by 8. But it would be nice to actually see the governor's version in all of these categories, what that would cost us annually and in total, and then the Senate version, and then the House version. Because I feel like, I don't know if I'm the only one, I'm trying to do the math on each separate page and try to follow the math all combined. And it sure would be awesome, since we're trying to make a big decision, if we could see that all on one page and we could see the impact of each one of these incentives in its totality. Is that possible?
Well, anything's possible.
And I'm thinking just a real simplistic table that would show each one. There's a small list here. No?
Yeah, and that is another thing I did want to mention. This doesn't include anything for property taxes.
Right, it doesn't, and doesn't have the sales tax for construction.
Right.
Right, so it would just be those larger incentives that fluctuate, that give us the difference of that $268 million ending balance. Or perhaps it's something that the chairman could provide for us, or research, or it'd just be helpful, because then we're actually comparing each credit apples to apples. Thank you for your consideration, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Auerkamp.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. On the Senate Apex assumption, I think I heard you correctly. So they turned it to a non-refundable?
Correct.
Over 3 years, which pretty much means it's basically just take it out of the bill. It's not going to ever be used, correct? Is that your assumption, to where you didn't have any numerical influence on these?
No, I mean, our assumption was that when they did their depreciation, they was going to offset any revenue that they have, so there would not be a refundable. And we were not anticipating them being providing any additional revenue to the state outside of this. So the total impact for a non-refundable credit, we had it literally at zero for those 8 years.
Okay, so the main thing in revenue, Senate assumptions, that's driving the decrease in revenues is the 0.5% corporate income tax reduction.
Correct.
So it's not necessarily the Senate's bill, it's mainly that portion of the Senate's bill that's driving us into a negative balance.
Right. When you implement that 0.5% additional every year, it would run the balance negative in 26.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further questions on the budget, how the House bill would affect the budget? Representative Croft?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just real quick, it may be an obvious, the payroll reimbursement, is that just the projected at $4,000 at $50,000 position? Could it go higher than that?
Yes.
If it's $5,000 and a $75,000 jobs?
Yes.
Okay, all right. And again, you said the total corporate tax was equivalent to 600 million?
This year, 600, I think for 23, we have it at 535.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Seeing none. Thank you, JG, for your work. committee, I go back to bill introductions. I have 2 bill introductions. I wasn't here when we opened the meeting. So we're going to go back to bill introductions. I have the first one is 22 RS 3079. And that is a farm winery bill regarding CMB licenses. Second one is 22 RS 3015. That's correct. And that is a bill regarding regulations in the Department of Labor. Without objection, we'll enter those. Stand by. Okay, committee, I'm going to open the bill hearing on, or the, sorry? Yeah. We're going to work the bill, the 3, it's my first time this year, I don't even know the right words to say. I think Representative Hoffman has a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move that we pass Senate Bill 347 favorable.
Okay, need a second on that. Seconded by Representative Dodson. I'm going to ask the revisers to do a quick overview of the bill.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. I will go through this quickly. It's the same bill that we discussed last week. So as the committee recalls, this Senate Bill 347 establishes a large economic development program. It pertains to 2 types of firms as defined in the bill. A qualified firm is defined as a business engaged in specified industries. Those are advanced manufacturing, aerospace, distribution, logistics and transportation, food and agriculture, or professional and technical services that will locate a facility in Kansas. There's also a provision for a headquarters project, and in that case, the business can be any business. There are some specified exclusions. The business cannot be engaged in mining, swine production, ranching, or gaming. Qualified supplier is a supplier of components for the qualified firm. It must be operating in Kansas for the purpose of supplying the qualified firm. Just quickly going through the sections. Section 1, of course, is a definition. Section 2 is the main section of the bill that lays out the program and benefit eligibility requirements. With respect to a qualified firm, those requirements include a commitment to a capital investment of at least $1 billion to be made within 5 years in a business facility in Kansas. Commence commercial operations at that qualified business facility within 5 years, and enter into an agreement with the Secretary of Commerce. A qualified firm, the requirements there are, a qualified firm can be eligible for a number of incentives. One would be the non-refundable tax credit, and as you recall in the bill before you, it's a non-refundable tax credit of up to 15% of the amount of the capital investment made in that qualified business facility, reimbursement of up to 50% of eligible education and training expenses for new employees, property tax exemption of 50% for a business facility or headquarters located in a foreign trade zone, and a sales tax exemption for materials and service costs associated with building the facility. With respect to a qualified supplier, the requirements to be eligible for benefits under the Act include that the qualified supplier be selected by the qualified firm as one of 5 suppliers eligible for benefits, meet an annual sales requirement to the qualified business facility of the qualified firm of at least $10 million annually, and again, enter into an agreement with the Secretary. The benefits available for qualified suppliers include the investment tax credit for just as for the qualified firm, except there's no minimum investment requirement. And as an alternative to the total payroll reimbursement provision for qualified firms, qualified suppliers can receive up to 65% retention of their employees' payroll withholding taxes. There are a number of other conditions that are set forth in the bill. The qualified firms and qualified suppliers must meet eligibility requirements each year to receive the incentives based on a review by the Secretary of Commerce. Qualified firms must repay unearned benefits if the minimum investment of $1 billion in the qualified business facility is not made. There's also a bond, a construction completion bond requirement for qualified firms if they don't meet a minimum investment rating that's determined by the Secretary. Qualified suppliers must repay incentives if the qualified firm does not commence operations. And there's also a requirement that recipients of benefits agree to an audit by the Secretary of Commerce if requested by the Secretary of by the Secretary of Revenue if requested by the Secretary of Commerce. And they also need to provide information with respect to the Department of Commerce's Economic Development Program database. And firms may also not participate in any other economic development program or fund administered by the Department of Commerce. There are a number of factors laid out in the bill that the Secretary of Commerce is to consider when determining the scope and the level of benefits. Those include the extent of prospective new employment, quality of new jobs, wage or salary levels, total amount of investment, potential for development of a respective industry in Kansas, potential for ancillary industry development, and indirect economic development. Also the benefit to the local, regional, state economy, including development of suppliers in Kansas. The rule and reg authority is provided for both the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Revenue in the bill. Section 3 sets out the investment tax credit. As you've heard, this is up to 15% of an investment made each year. And that in the bill before you, that's claimed over the next, it's earned in 1 year, claimed over the next 3 successive taxable years. The remaining amounts may be carried forward, and any earned credit remaining unused after 3 years is forfeited. There's no refundability. Section 4 discusses payroll withholding tax retention benefit for qualified suppliers. Again, they can earn up to 65% of the payroll taxes for their employees up to a period of 10 successive years. Section 5 discusses the reimbursement of annual total payroll costs for a qualified firm's employees at a qualified firm's facility. Again, those can be reimbursed for up to 10 successive years, and that is subject to appropriations. There's a fund set up in the bill for that purpose, for paying that benefit. Section 7 provides a training and education expense that's available for both qualified firms and qualified suppliers. Reimbursement may be up to 50% of eligible expenses, maximum limit of $5 million per business per year. And again, that is subject to appropriations. There's also a fund set up for paying that benefit in the bill. Section 8 creates a fund, as I mentioned, to pay that benefit. Section 9 allows a property tax exemption of 50% for real property taxes levied on any new manufacturing property or new headquarters that is located in a foreign trade zone owned by a qualified firm or qualified supplier and is participating in the foreign trade zone program. Section 10 provides a sales tax exemption, as mentioned, for the construction of the qualified business facility by the qualified firm, and also qualified suppliers are also eligible. Section 11 sets out some reports that must be made by the Secretary of Commerce, the Governor, the Senate Commerce Committee, and the House Commerce, Labor, and Economic Development Committee. And there's also a quarterly report requirement to the chairpersons of the Senate and House Commerce Committees on the number of projects that may qualify. Section 12, as discussed, provides for a 0.05% reduction in the corporate income tax rate for each tax year following a fiscal year in which a qualified firm or qualified supplier receives benefits under the Act. Section 13 and 14 are just amendatory sections for the statutory sections that require amendments for purposes of the bill. Section 15 is the sunset. No agreement may be entered into by the Secretary on and after March 31, 2023. The bill is effective upon publication in the Kansas Register.
Okay, knowing that we've gone through this bill several times, are there any questions on the bill that came to us that we're discussing right now? Representative Croft.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have one clarification. Are the suppliers or the firms, are they able to participate in star bond projects on this? I just didn't see that in there.
Let me check. In the original bill, star bond projects weren't specifically mentioned. There were a couple of programs that were mentioned, the HPIP, the training programs that Commerce does, and also I think the PEAK. And I think star bonds were added as well by the Senate committee. Just need to...
They were, according to my reading of the bill, it was inserted just before the other two, and it states that they cannot participate in star bond bill or in the star bond projects. However, it doesn't mention that there can't be the commerce that it creates. It doesn't mention that someone else can't form a star bond district next to it and capture all that retail that's going on. So that is a concern we need to look at.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And questions I should know the answer to it by now, but in the qualified investment part on page 3, starting line 29, if it's the original cost or value and the total value is defined, could there be some other incentives that are a part of that that would be included in the value? And then the next piece on the 8 times rental rate on line 39, I get how that works. If I accrue it over 5 different years, do I get to take 8 times my rental rate for each of the 5 years, or is that a one-time calculation that's part of the qualified investment?
Representative, this definition of investment was taken from HPIP, so it would apply, I believe, in the same manner, and I would probably need to defer to Commerce to explain the specifics of how exactly they would apply that.
Deputy Secretary Hughes is here. Deputy Secretary, do you understand the HPIP program enough to discuss that, answer that question? Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In response to the question, that 8-year calculation is in the event of building leases, and how do we account that the value of the lease towards qualifying for the program? So in that instance, they're trying to cover whether a mega project, which personally I think is quite unlikely they would lease a building of that size, but it's trying to cover create that contingency. If somebody wanted to lease a 3 million square foot building, how would we do the calculation for it?
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the answer. And I would assume it could also be if they wanted to lease a fraction of a facility or a particular piece, not necessarily the whole, right? I might be able to look at a part of my total investment as a lease.
I think that's a reasonable expectation if they were, say, renting warehouse space or something to that effect.
And so then if I did that, would I get an 8 times calculation for each year of the 5, or would it just be one that is done, and how the HPIP and this would work?
It would be one, and the purpose is to calculate whether that new building, I'm assuming it's outside of the parameters of the APEX program, but does that one building now qualify for the program?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Are there any further questions for the reviser? Okay, seeing none, we'll open the bill for discussion and talk about the balloon amendment that we discussed last week. And so can we hand that out if we have it? I'm sorry, we have an updated version of what we discussed last week. Could you hand that out and we can go through it? Thanks. In committee, we don't have digital copies of the amendment available for the committee yet. They'll be emailed to Cindy eventually, and we'll get them out to the committee for review and for public to see for the minutes. So Charles, it's my understanding that any changes to this amendment don't really change the intent, just how we get there, a more legal way of describing it. And if I go through the amendment, it's going to be virtually the same as we discussed last week. Was there a change in the I think there was one change as far as what we would pay a supplier for training, and that was the only significant change. Charles.
Yeah, there are, significant changes to the language, but primarily it's, as you stated, to fully carry out the intent.
Chairman. Charles.
One change is to make it clear that the approval of the State Finance Council is not required for the agreement. It's only required for prior to an agreement being entered into by the Secretary with a firm for approval of benefit levels that are above the discretion of the Secretary. So it's sort of with this approval of State Finance Council, the Secretary can offer some additional benefits with respect to the number of years that the investment tax credit is paid, a shorter period, or a higher level of total payroll, percentage of the total payroll that would be reimbursed. And so the change is to make clear that the State Finance Council is not approving the agreement, it's just approving those increases in benefit levels that are beyond the Secretary's discretion.
Okay, right. So that was the original intent. Just that we had the whole agreement needing to be approved at one point, and we scratched that for now. Representative Williams, did you have a question before we go through the amendment?
I actually have a question to follow up for Charles. I don't think the answer was given for one of the questions from Representative Johnson. On page 3, on the property, original cost if owned by the qualified firm. I don't think we got that answer from Commerce or from Charles, whether or not if a property were given to the firm, if it would be counted as their original investment.
Representative Johnson?
It's on page 3.
So thanks. Yes, that question, whether it be that or any other incentive package that might be a part of the deal and coming up with the investment.
Charles?
Well, again, I have to refer to Commerce for specifics, but as the language in the bill is written, there has to be a $1 billion investment. So they have to get there one way or another.
Yes, Charles, but I think what we're trying to understand is can they use, if something is passed to them, if they receive a certain amount of land and there's no charge, if they receive a building and it's passed to them, can they take the value of that land, can they take the value of that building and roll that in there, as well as any local incentives that are provided for them, can they use those to get to that $1 billion mark?
I guess is the investment defined?
It's only what I see is on page 3, line 38, such property original cost if owned by the qualified firm. It's really not explicit. We might ask how Commerce interprets that.
I did ask that question to the Department of Commerce, and they said that any land grants that were given to a company would not count towards the investment, only the dollars that they actually pay.
If that being the case, Chairman, I would just ask that it's clearly defined in our bill, so there's no ambiguity.
Deputy Secretary, that was the answer, is that correct? That if we give a company a building under this program, for example, and that building's worth $10 million, that doesn't count towards their investment because they didn't pay for it.
That's correct, Mr. Chair. In that instance, it would be considered part of our incentive package, not part of the investment made by the qualifying firm.
Okay, thanks for clearing that up. And we need to make sure that the definition of investment reflects that. Okay, we'll move on to the, I'm going to attempt to explain this balloon amendment, and we're going to go through it. We went through it last week, so I think everybody is aware of it. So hopefully we'll get through it quickly. But we need to make sure everybody's on the same page. So the first thing the amendment does is it takes the tax credit that we were talking about, and takes what the Senate did, which basically made it so that it's worth zero, the tax credit, because you'll never, on a $4 billion investment, you'll be depreciating that asset over many, many, many years. And if you only can get a tax credit that's credited toward what you pay in taxes, and it dies in 3 years, there's no benefit under this program. Versus the governor's version had you paying it out in 3 years, which looks like it's going to damage the budget pretty well. This amendment changes that from a 3-year payout to a 10-year payout and makes it refundable again. That way, the state is assured to be receiving some of the benefits from the production and from the employment of individuals, and they can better afford to pay the large sums over a 10-year period versus having to pay it before we receive a benefit. It also gives some accountability to where if the project needed to be less than 10 years, or if the payout needed to be less than 10 years, and the secretary could show the finance council that it made sense to the budget, the finance council would have the ability to vote and approve a lesser number of years. We felt it important to have a second set of eyes on that kind of an offer. Also, we reduced the payroll reimbursement to 7.5% instead of 10%. And we applied the same accountability so that if the secretary felt like he needed to go above 7.5%, or she go above 7.5%, they would report it out to this finance council, and the finance council could approve that. We just needed to make sure we had some checks and balances. The original bill gave a lot of incentives to suppliers, but did not require the supplier to actually reside in the state of Kansas. And so this balloon amendment makes it so that they actually have to reside in the state of Kansas. We felt that was important. No reason to pay for somebody's investment in another state. We redefined the qualified employee because the question was asked if we did business with a company, I think in China, and an executive in China was assigned several $1 million in payroll to this Kansas company, would we pay 10% of that? And the answer was yes, the way the bill was written. And so we redefined a qualified employee to be somebody that actually works on site. We discussed residency. We couldn't come to an agreement with everybody having to live in Kansas because we sold the entire, we can sell the entire metropolitan area as an employee base, and it's more valuable that way, hoping that they'll live in Kansas. We do have in this amendment as well that it would be a requirement of the Secretary of State to insert Kansas residency as something that they look at and a goal that they set with the company to have a certain number of them working in the state of Kansas, living in the state of Kansas as a resident. We also applied some money to help if the company is going to move employees to the metropolitan area. We want to make sure that they live in Kansas, and so we would help them pay for a portion of the relocation only if they moved to the state of Kansas and reside in the state of Kansas. This amendment right-sized the incentives for suppliers. Original bill had no minimum or cap on the 15% credit for the suppliers. This one changes that the limit's created to $100 million with a sliding scale, so that more investment means more credit. We reduced the credit to 10%, or I believe it's 5%, is that right? 5% instead of 15% for the suppliers. But they could add an additional 1% for every $10 million of investment over $50 million. Training reimbursement for the original bill was $5 million per year for 5 years for a total of $125 million. We think that might have been a typo, but either way, it wasn't caught. When they reviewed the bill and when the Senate passed the bill, we changed that, as we discussed a little bit ago, to $250,000 per supplier with a $12.5 million total, and that's 5 years for five employees. We also struck the portion of the bill that addressed the property tax abatements. The original bill allowed for 50% only if you lived in a certain type of a district or area, and there was no cap on it. It could go forever if the secretary said it could. That was unconstitutional, and so we had to strike the entire section because we cannot favor one area of the state over another when we give property tax abatements, and we cannot go over 10 years. Couldn't find a fix for what the secretary was wanting to offer, and so we struck that section, at least for now. I think that pretty much explains. Did I leave anything out, Charles? Yes, so we made the change on supplier as far as participating in reimbursement for training. we changed the supplier down to $250,000 per year per company. It was at $500,000. Or actually, it was at the $125 million. So we made that change. Any questions for the reviser or any questions on the proposed amendment? Representative Williams.
Okay, I thought Representative Clayton was first, but if she's good, I'll go ahead. All right, so you mentioned the relocation expenses if they are Kansas residents. I couldn't find that. What page is that on?
Charles.
That should be an attachment to the balloon. It should be at the end.
Right here. Is that it?
That's the fund language, and then the section that lays out the benefit is right in front of that.
Okay, and then another question is, can we just clarify, because it's kind of hard to chase through the bill, all these different items. Did you say the firm payroll reimbursement is 7.5% over 10 years? Or is it 5%?
I'm sorry, with respect to which benefit?
The firm payroll reimbursement.
The Secretary has discretion up to 7.5% for 10 successive years, and if you go higher than that, up to 10%, you need State Finance Council approval.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Representative Clayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Charles, and in committee, if I could just have you turn to page 19 of the amendment. Just walking down to section C. So I see it says the rate reduction of 0.5% shall be applied to reduce the normal tax on corporations imposed pursuant to, and amendments there too. Then I see another balloon that says until reduced to 0%. Can you offer some clarification on that, please? I see that the tax on corporations being reduced to 0%, and then the rate reduction shall next be applied to the surtax on corporations until reduced to 0. But just explain to me a little bit more about what that intent is, please.
Adam Siebers, I'll take this question since it deals with tax, and I'm the one who drafted this. Essentially what this provision does, new section 12, anytime, if you look in subsection A, in the balloon, kind of it's a jagged line, but it enters into an agreement. So every year that there'd be an entered into agreement with the Secretary of Commerce for a new firm, a 0.5% reduction in the normal tax on corporations would be reduced for the successive year. And that only applies to the normal rate, not the surtax. The surtax language on the bill that came over from the Senate was stricken, so that provision is gone. In effect, there can only be a maximum of 2 years since the bill is sunset. Since only one can be in there's a limit of 1 per year, and the bill only has a 2-year application. So in effect, it can only be a maximum of under the bill of a 1% reduction currently.
Thank you. Thank you for the clarification.
Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question, but I need to go back to what was just said because I didn't track why this says in the balloon until reduced to 0.
I guess in effect that just kind of closes the loop. However, under the language of, I do agree that is a little confusing, but it takes the normal rate down to 0 potentially, but there's also the de facto sunset at the end of the balloon that they're not entering into new agreements. So it kind of gives an end clause, but that end clause will never be met unless the bill is further expanded in successive legislative sessions.
I'm slow today, but I'll try to digest that. I thought I heard Charles make reference to headquarters. Are there implications in this bill whether or not the qualified firm is headquartered in the state?
Charles?
I'm not
quite sure what your question means. I mean, yes, the headquarters does have to be in the state, but that's probably not what you were asking.
No, that is what I'm asking.
Oh, it is, okay. Yes, the headquarters would have to be located in the state.
Representative Clayton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If we could have some clarification regarding clawbacks, because I'm noting that it says all, but I don't know if it should say that. So if we could have some more clarification there, please.
So the primary clawback language is on, may I?
Go ahead.
The primary clawback language is on page 7 of the balloon. I'll get there myself. So the intent here is that there would be a clawback of benefits that flow from any breach in the agreement. So benefits that are connected to or associated with a term or condition that's breached, they would be, repaid or susceptible to repayment. And then there's also provision that the Secretary is to report any material breach to the State Finance Council within 14 calendar days of the Secretary first becoming aware of such breach, so a little bit of oversight there. I think the Secretary would have some discretion as to whether or not the agreement is breached, but then we have a little bit of oversight by the State Finance Council.
Representative Dodson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I was listening to your kind of summary there. I just want to double check a couple things if I can. On page 11, line 16, in the balloon amendment, we had taken out, I guess, or someone had the term taxable.
I'm having difficulty hearing you. Is your microphone turned on?
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
So on page 11, line 16, we had, I think, taken out the word taxable, and it's back in this version we have now, correct? 5 years taxable.
Charles?
Unless Adam tells me one of those phrases is used with respect to the actual terms of the tax credit, the taxable language is to be, the investment has to be made in 5 calendar years, not taxable years. But I'm thinking about your question. I'm not sure if that's exactly what it was.
Yeah, I mean, we had it taken out and then we put it back in. That was my question. In the version you just gave us, it says taxable year, so.
Representative, are you referring to the refundability aspect or the actual word taxable in line 16?
The actual word.
Go back to what Chuck said. I think what that's referring to is the total qualified investment must be completed within 5 years. So it's, taxable years is usually a January 1st through December 31st. So this is more of to me, this would give it a calendar year, May 12th through May 12th, 5 years later. So that's my interpretation of what that would mean, but I'd have to.
Is on line 16?
Correct.
There we are, okay. And then on page 12, line 18, in the other version we had the little balloon where it says reinsert qualified supplier, and then this one has it stricken. So is that our intent?
Yeah, sorry. That may have been something that is just a technical correction, as Charles reminded me. As these versions have come through, originally it was just stricken out, but since there's a qualified supplier credit, that provision is administrative provision, so that's why there's almost a credit for a qualified firm and a qualified supplier, and they're essentially 2 separate credits. There's different qualifications for each. In this paragraph E here, we need the language or qualified supplier to give the Secretary rules and regs authority over that credit also. It's more of just purely a technical change to me.
And then just to double check on page 15, line 39, we're at 500,000, is that correct?
So the maximum amount of reimbursement, and this is with respect to the training or education expense reimbursement provision, that applies to both qualified firms and qualified suppliers. The maximum amount is $250,000 per year that can be reimbursed, actually paid to the qualified supplier. And the maximum amount for reimbursement that's paid to a qualified firm is limited at $5 million per year. And of course, again, the scope and level of those benefits are in the discretion of the Secretary.
And just the last one on page 59, line 38. So we're at 2 years, is that right, for sunset? Yeah. I just want to make sure I have my assumptions right here on.
Yes, Representative, the sunset is May 1st, 2024, and again, the language is the Secretary can't consider a new application, proceed with an application that has been submitted, or enter into any agreement with a qualified firm or qualified supplier pursuant to Section 2 on and after May 1st, 2024.
No, thanks very much. Appreciate it, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Clayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just a point of clarification, either you or staff could offer this. Did the portion about the incentives that Commerce can offer in addition to Apex change at all?
The only change was as far as other incentive packages. Originally, the property tax was capped at 50% and unlimited. Now the locals can offer whatever they see fit as far as what they want to offer. But anything that's not mentioned in this bill can still be used.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further questions or comments on the Bloom Amendment? Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, so in terms of accountability, we talked about the State Finance Council at least on 2 different incentives. The Secretary of Commerce would need to bring any changes back to the State Finance Council for the investment tax credit and the payroll reimbursement. But I seem to recall that last week we heard that there was one more and I can't identify it. Is there anything else in this bill where it has to be approved by State Finance Council other than those 2?
Representative, so it's only with respect to the tax investment credit for the qualified firm, the tax investment credit for the qualified supplier, which are sort of now 2 separate provisions, and the payroll percentage reimbursement for the qualified firm.
Okay, thank you. Then that's the 3. And then in terms of the breach of contract, if there have been any terms or conditions that weren't fulfilled by the company, are those items that the Secretary of Commerce would bring back to the State Finance Council, or does it direct any reporting back to the State Finance Council, or is it just back to the Legislature per their annual report?
I think the way it's worded in each section so that if they fail to make the capital investment that they had promised, then that incentive could be clawed back. However, the way we are now structuring it over a 10-year period, they would just not receive the benefit because they didn't make the investment, which makes it a lot easier rather than having to claw it back. And then, like the training, if they breach the training, they could also claw that back. So it's designed to kind of give flexibility to tailor the remedy to each breach.
Okay. All right, thank you. And then in terms of the major changes that you outlined in the balloon, we know that we're switching the non-refundable back to refundable, and that the property tax is out. It's back to local decision on the 10 years. But then the only other significant change then that I'm seeing is the 7.5% for firm payroll reimbursement. Is that the only significant change in terms of monetary change?
We changed the payout over 10 years.
Not counting the years.
Okay, so the qualified suppliers are no longer at a 15% credit. They are at a 5% credit.
Up to 10.
Paid up to 10 based on their investment.
Okay.
And that is also paid over 10 years. Also, we slimmed down the reimbursement for the training.
All right, just crystal clear. Thank you.
I know, unfortunately, this is a rush job. And currently, that's what this amendment says. After we vote on this amendment, if it goes on and you have any specific changes that you'd like to make to it, we would certainly entertain that. I believe there is another amendment that we discussed last Thursday on another clawback that would be between the years of 10 years and 15 years out. Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the reimbursement for payroll is now 7%, not 10%, correct?
It is 7.5. It can go to 10 if the secretary approaches the finance council and gets approval.
Okay. So because the goal is to, grow the economy and grow jobs, is there anything in this that requires them to, of those 4,000 employees, for a certain percentage of those to be actually new employees and not just other employees from other firms in the state?
I don't believe there are. It's net new jobs to the company.
So theoretically, this probably wouldn't happen, but theoretically, half of those jobs could be from other companies within the state that we are now going to lose money on because we're going to start paying for their 7% of their employees, or 7% of their pay, because they're no longer working for X company, now they're working for Y company.
That would be a true statement, and it's up to 7.5%, so it could be less, but my guess is it would be 7.5% or more.
7.5%, yeah. But, okay, so there's nothing to preclude that from happening?
Not currently.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Clayton.
Thank you, and thank you for all of your indulgence, Mr. Chair. I've got a representative who's working from their office today due to COVID precautions. They are in the building, but is the amendment available on the S drive for their review? All right, so just for the edification of the group, that amendment, the digital amendment, is being sent out here in just a moment for us to review on our screens, because not everyone who is on the committee currently has a copy, because not everyone can physically attend here in this room due to COVID precautions. So we'll just hang back for a little bit until they get that.
Yes, it's almost identical to the amendment that we discussed on Thursday. I would hope that he would received a copy of that by now, but if not, then it is what it is. Representative Auerkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quick question on the income tax reduction. I think it was mentioned both ways last Thursday. I think there was mention of a corporate income tax going down, but there was also a comment made that all Kansas businesses should benefit from one of these programs. This only benefits corporations, right? This doesn't benefit other Kansas businesses, LLCs, partnerships?
That is the way it's currently written, yes. It's for ratchet down the corporate income tax. It was discussed that one of the biggest barriers to entry or for growth of corporations in Kansas is that our income tax is quite high for corporations, and this would be a way to reduce that to make us more competitive, so that when a large corporation resides in Kansas and another state, and they have the opportunity to grow. Currently, they're growing in other states more so than they are here. And so that was what the discussion was around, at least in the Senate. That's how it was explained to me. And that's why it was strictly limited to corporate income tax. But I agree with you. All businesses should have some way to participate. We're using everyone's tax to pay for this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Croft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a clarifying question on page 12, the insert that's on line 8. If you could just, it says it can be up to 50%. The secretary may raise it to 100%. Does he have any requirements to clear that, to make it to the 100%, or does he get to make that all on his own?
Yeah, that would be a discretion of the secretary.
Okay.
So I would just add to what Adam's response. There are some factors listed in that section. It was subsection D that needs to be changed, but there are a number of factors that are laid out, including creation of new jobs, including new jobs for suppliers, benefit to the local, regional, or state economy, including the development of suppliers in Kansas, the amount of the capital investment, the benefit to the development of the qualified firms industry in Kansas, and in addition, employment, retention, and attraction of employees to remain residents of or relocate to Kansas, and then finally other measures or goals, if any, of the Secretary consistent with the purposes of the Act. And those are on page 12, lines 10 through 17, and then in it also the balloon that ties in there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just wanting to clarify that part. Thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none, I would need a second on my motion, seconded by Representative Long. Seeing no further discussion on the amendment. You've all heard the amendment. All in favor of the amendment, say aye. Aye. All against the amendment, say no. Motion passes. Are there, Charles, go ahead.
My apologies, Chairman. I need to ask for some discretion on the part of the revisor's office. There are just a few things that need to be, there's a double word in one line, there's an or that needs to be struck, there's some spacing that we need to adjust, so that kind of thing. And also, I guess I need to ask whether Representative Williams' request was part of this, and if so, we would need discretion to draft that additional language.
Representative Williams, as far as the definition of investment, is that what you're saying? Yes.
Yes.
Yes, that was a clarification. And without objection, we'll allow technical cleanup on this entire bill. Seeing no objection, you're good to go. Any other amendments? Representative Highland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment, and it's the 10 to the 15 year. I'll wait till it's distributed.
Representative, you want to explain your amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I came up with this amendment because of my concerns that if a company receives all these benefits and then they leave after the 10th year and move to another state. So I have put in here a clawback, and it's ratcheted down between the 10th and the 15th year. I figure after 15 years, they've met their obligation. Charles may have to add to it if there's more to it.
Sorry about that, committee. I'm trying to figure out the rest of our day here because we're running up against tax. Any questions on the amendment? Seeing no questions, do you have a second on the amendment? Seconded by Representative Croft. Seeing no further discussion, you've heard the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All against say no. Motion passes. Are there any other amendments? I have an amendment under the report that the Secretary sends to the Department or sends to the Commerce committees. Not quite sure what page that's on. We ask for number of employees, number of new employees, but we do not ask for, I think it's on page 14. So the Secretary has to certify that the number of employees, the gross wages, is that the report, Charles? The report to the committees. It's later in the bill, sorry.
That's on page
18. Okay. Page 18 and 19, I simply want to add a report. In that report, it's not hard to figure out. I would like to know the employee residence. For example, how many employees live in Kansas or reside in Kansas, and how many employees reside in other states. We don't need down to the individual, but just the number of employees that reside in Kansas. Seconded by Representative Long. Questions, Representative Clayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in this report, would it just say the percentage of employees that live in Kansas, or would it be a breakdown of all others that live in, for instance, Nebraska, Colorado, et cetera?
Yes, by state.
By state.
Residents by state.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Representative Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since I don't have an amendment for could we add in that reporting the number of employees that were previously employed outside the state, so that we know new ones coming in, new employees coming into the state? You understand what I'm saying?
I would have no issues changing it to include that if it was okay with the second. However, it would be if that information is available. I mean, it may not be.
Right, okay. I mean, I would think that they would know. The firm's going to know whether they hired him from within the state or out of the state.
Well, and we'll certainly know if we paid to relocate them.
Well, that's true. That's definitely true. Okay.
Any other questions? Seeing none, you've heard the motion. All in favor say aye. Aye. All against say no. I have one final amendment. Being that we discussed the impact on the budget for each of these bills, I would like to make an amendment that this incentive is paid out over 10 years without the ability to reduce it, and that the State Finance Council approved the offer. Charles.
Just clarification, Chairman, when you say incentive, are you referring to the tax investment credit?
I'm referring to tax investment credit for the firm and the suppliers. Should be paid out over 10 years, at least for this experiment. We need to make sure that we don't jeopardize the budget by the State Finance Council saying that they could go down to a 3-year like was proposed in the original bill. I just don't want any outside pressures on that. I just want it to be, in my opinion, based on what we heard in appropriations today and what we heard on the budget review, this benefit needs to be paid out over 10 years until we actually can have some real good data on the return on investment without jeopardizing the budget. Representative Auerkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I understand the current language correctly, it's 10 years from that year of investment, and there's going to be varying amounts each year in the first 5 years. So when you say paid out over 10 years, is that an equal amount, or does that still follow that same sequence of
Yes,
10 years from the
is
time of the
not to
budget?
change the underlying bill, only to remove the ability of the State Finance Council to approve the payout over less than 10 years.
Thank you.
And that the investment, or the State Finance Council review the agreement before it is offered. We need to have oversight. Charles.
Chairman, thank you. So just clarification on the State Finance Council review the agreement piece. So just to be clear, is your motion that the State Finance Council approves the agreement and the agreement cannot be made without the approval of the State Finance Council, or something different than that?
Yes, that's my intent, that they review anytime before it's offered or signed. They just have to approve it before the deal gets done, with the same wording that they would approve the 10 years down to whatever would be requested as far as the votes. Representative Long seconds that amendment. Any discussion? Representative Clayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is my understanding, and it's difficult because I would feel much more comfortable if I had the actual printed language in front of me to read, but it is my understanding that this type of amendment would basically negate the entire reason why we would be voting on this bill. I think that it would be incredibly detrimental to this and any other future project, and I will be voting against it. Thank you.
Representative Auerkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Being that this is essentially I don't know, according to my numbers, close to $1 billion tax on the people of Kansas, it does seem reasonable that at least a few of the legislators should have some oversight on that tax increase. So I think it's a good amendment to a bill that can't use the same adjective for.
I'm glad you could join us today, sir. Representative Dodson.
Yes, Mr. Chair, if you just restate that, I was trying to write it down and I didn't get all of it. So I think Representative Auerkamp is correct. I like the oversight piece. We've discussed that for some time, and just like to hear the language one more time.
Okay, currently in the bill, there's an ability for the Finance Council to approve less than 10 years, but there's no floor. They could go down as low as they want to, and the request on the original bill was 3, which in my opinion is extremely dangerous to the budget. This just removes their ability to approve anything less than 10 years until, this is an experiment, and a very dangerous experiment. We want to make sure we keep our eyes on it, and we make sure we make wise decisions to protect the budget going forward. After we have some data, if we do one of these major deals, then we could certainly entertain going shorter if we can learn that the investment actually pays off. But for now, I'd like it that it was paid out over a 10-year period, because that's what makes sense. Representative Ralph.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of clarifying for this particular amendment. So the amendment, first off, the amendment is going to require that the State Finance Council approve, not just simply review?
My guess is that the underlying bill would cause the Secretary to come talk to them and get approval to go less than 10 years on any offer. So right now they would have oversight over the bill. by changing that to a 10-year payout, there would be no oversight by the Finance Council, and I want to make sure we maintain extra eyes on a multi-billion-dollar investment.
Okay, then, if I could follow up, so am I misunderstanding? The State Finance Council is simply going to be having approval on what you just described there, or are we talking about the State Finance Council having an approval over the entire agreement with the qualified firm?
Over the entire agreement with the qualified firm.
Okay, so two things in that regard then. Is there, excuse me, for the purposes of that approval, is there a time frame for the State Finance Council to make that approval first?
No, then there isn't in the underlying bill for the 10 years or the 7.5, which they would have to review the entire offer in order to approve.
And I guess my second question is maybe a little rhetorical. Is there a concern of the Department of Commerce entering into what's obviously going to be a pretty significant negotiation with a qualified firm, and by the time they reach the end of that, is the State Finance Council going to be involved in any part of that negotiation process, or are they simply going to have a look at the final bill, and if they don't approve it, then it's just start over?
I would imagine it would work the same that it would currently, that if they didn't like what was being offered, they could renegotiate. Not the State Finance Council, but they would be able to approve or disapprove any offer and offer suggestions for a different offer. These deals aren't booked overnight, multi-billion-dollar deals.
Well,
and so
absolutely. I mean,
the State Finance Council can meet any time of the week.
But even back home with smaller ones, I mean, these many times are 6, 7, 8 month. That's why I had some concern as to how much involvement State Finance Council would have to be at a spot where they could weigh in of approval or not. But thank you, Mr. Chair.
I understand that, but my issue is that it's a multi-billion-dollar deal, and they should probably have some sort of understanding on what's going on. Representative Stocksdale.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to make sure I'm understanding this, and of course, I'm new to the understanding of this bill here and everything, but with this amendment, it sounds like to me the State Finance Council could negate the work of this committee, which then goes to the full legislature, and if they approve it, and it's approved and it's wanted by the Department of Commerce, doesn't that put the overall approval of what we've done in this committee, what we've done in the legislature, and what the Commerce Department has done into the hands of a handful of legislators?
It certainly would reflect the will of the committee if this amendment went on. Yes, absolutely, you're correct. It would be the will of this committee and the will of the House if it passed the House in order to have approval. So if we say in here that we want approval, it is the will of our committee. And if we say on the House we want approval, it is the will of the House. Then it takes us to the Senate for negotiations after that.
Okay, so my concern is that I want to make sure that this committee and the House and our colleagues in the legislature, the will of our entire legislative group supersedes the veto power of a small handful of people.
Well, we're giving them the veto power in this bill if they wanted.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I mean, otherwise we're being fiscally irresponsible. This is a very dangerous experiment that we're being asked to do with a refundable tax credit. Representative Clayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to make a substitute motion. My substitute motion is Tar Water 3 is the language that he just verbally laid out, but with 5 years instead of 10.
Do we have a second on that? Representative Hsu. Discussion, Representative Burrows.
Well, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. To expedite this along, I just want to ensure, those of us who have been here a while know that there's been discretion over the years given to the Secretary of Commerce, who has the resources at that office to move forward on these programs, and he asks, the secretary usually asks for cooperation of the legislature to put some guidelines in place. And I go back from some of the history I've dealt with. I've had a political. We've had a Republican administration for a majority of the time that I've been here, and there's been a lot of trust put into the Secretary of Commerce and very little battles done over the fact that they have the discretion in which to look at the data. And it seems now that that is asking to be changed. We have a multi-billion-dollar project with the potential to come here, and I've never seen a body or a process slow something down to the extent that it does. And I agree, Mr. Chairman, we need to be prudent in what we're doing. But we are a legislative body. We're all going to be painted with the same brush. So I'm a little reserved in giving my authority or my support or my objections to a small amount of legislators. And it's no secret, I've served in leadership. And so it's pertinent that while we are here, that we set the guidelines, and I don't even like the 5-year. And this is it's not necessarily an experiment, it's an opportunity. And we'll have a chance to look at the data, and if we need to change it, Mr. Chairman, I would assume that we could come back to committee and do that maybe even next year when the information starts coming in. So I'm a little, I'm going to object to the 10-year, even the 5-year, because I just really believe that we're not doing our due diligence and putting it into a group of individuals' hands that may not have all the data and all the authority in which to do what you're asking to do, Mr. Chairman. But thank you for that opportunity.
Representative Ralph.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess the comment I want to make as I think about it is, since we've got a substitute motion, this may not be appropriate time, but as I sat here and thought for a moment about what the original amendment was and now the substitute, I'm not really concerned one way or another about the 5-year to the 10-year or those pieces, but I wanted to go ahead and say at this point, I think what this committee and hopefully the House floor will do is provide the parameters within which we believe this deal could appropriately be done. But the idea of making all of that negotiation then contingent upon another review of another group of folks is not a good strategic idea, and I wouldn't be able to support that piece. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Clayton.
At this time, I can go ahead and withdraw my substitute motion, or I would like to with permission of the chair.
Yes. Withdrawn. We're back on the main amendment. Okay. I would just say before we take a vote that I certainly, after seeing what we saw in appropriations this morning and what we saw going into this today, I certainly would rather have 7 qualified members of the legislature approve a deal that they're very aware of, especially this first one. They're all already aware of everything and they've already kind of approved the deal. It's not that hard to do, but my gosh, to leave one person, no matter who it is, in charge of a multi-billion-dollar refundable tax credit is, in my mind, fiscally irresponsible and way too far out on a limb. We need to have some sort of oversight. And so with that, I'll close my amendment. You've heard the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All against say no.
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 Chair's in question. All in favor, raise your right hand. Good. All against, raise your right hand, and anyone online, please show your camera and your office in the background.
WebEx isn't showing, Mr. Chair, but it is Representative Ruiz that is raising his hand.
And he's in his office.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Okay. What's the count? (13 to 8), motion passes. Any further discussion on the bill? Representative Burrows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to be recorded no, if I may, please.
Representative Burrows wants to be recorded as no. Seeing no further discussion on the bill, we can.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Ruiz, he still has his hand. I believe he wants his vote.
He wants his vote recorded. Okay. No. Stogsdale's no. Seeing no further discussion on the bill, we will. Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will move that we pass out, do we want to do a substitute?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. House substitute for Senate Bill 347, favorable for passage.
Okay, so you've heard the motion. All in favor of passage, say aye. Aye. All against, say no.
No.
Motion passes. Thank you, committee, and my apologies to the tax committee for going so late, but this was an important venture. Thanks. Bye.